Well, welcome back to our podcast. I am E-Man.
And I am Pastor Dan.
And today we're going to talk about COVID. Now, neither me or Dan are medical professionals. All we're doing here is talking to you, our friends, like we're at a dinner party, masked and distanced. And we're going to discuss the facts of COVID as best as we know them. This is to spark discussion. We're not giving you anything to act on. Talk to your doctor. Talk to any professional you know in the medical field before you make any decision. This is simply a discussion to spur your own research. So,
perfect.
With that, number one question, is COVID real?
Is COVID real?
Yes.
I guess I would have to say, what exactly is the definition of COVID?
Right. Well, I mean, SARS-CoV-2, right? That's the official name because it's the SARS stands for sudden acute respiratory syndrome, severe acute respiratory syndrome.
Right.
It's, as far as we know, only caused by the coronavirus family. Now, because it's called SARS-CoV-2, I'm assuming it's the second such SARS virus.
Well, I think there's a lot of opinions on exactly what's happening here, and I don't know if we need to maybe start the podcast over here if I say something
that's a little too rabbit hole. I'm going to go with the assumption it's a real virus.
Okay. I would think it's a man-made virus.
Yes, but it still exists.
Oh, yeah, it's a real thing, but it's more of a bioweapon than a virus. Possibly.
So, and my next point is that it's most likely the product of a Chinese virology lab in Wuhan. That was considered a conspiracy theory a year ago. Now it's pretty much a mainstream view of it. Even liberal American comedians are starting to say how stupid it is not to believe. I think Jon Stewart went on a tirade on the Colbert Show, and it was like Colbert was getting very nervous, and Stewart was just pounding at they have a lab called the Coronavirus Lab. That's where it came out of.
Despite the Western, mainstream media denying it and slapping anybody off of YouTube and Twitter who would say it.
Yes.
A year later, everybody knows what we've known all along, that this was a man-made virus that came out of a lab in China.
I would say most likely for sure. Again, I'm just saying, I'm being open-minded.
Yeah, okay.
So, now we do know that the Chinese Communist Party knew about COVID as early as the summer of 2019. I would believe even earlier. Because there's evidence now of infections in the U.S. as early as February 2019, which is all guesswork at this point, but they knew it at least in the summer of 2019. Now, they did not restrict internal travel until January 2020, and they did not do anything about international travel until March 2020. So that's why it spread.
Okay.
So for that, we call the Zika virus because it comes from the Zika Valley in South America.
Right.
West Nile virus is called because it comes out of the West Nile in Africa. Spanish flu it should be called the Kansas military flu, but we call it the Spanish flu. Whatever. We always call things from their origin. So I like to call this the Chinese coronavirus. Okay. If you don't mind.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Okay, fair enough.
It sounds logical.
Now, RNA viruses enter the cells, our cells, dump the RNA contents inside. RNA is, if DNA is the double helix, it looks like a ladder. Cut the ladder in half along the rungs. That's RNA. It's a half of DNA.
Oh, okay.
So it spews out a half ladder, but there's enzymes that copy the opposite side, that make it into a DNA strand.
Okay.
Then it's got another piece of enzyme that drives it into our nucleus, and it splices it into our DNA. Then it hijacks our cell and forces that cell to only photocopy that chunk of DNA, which is the viral RNA.
Okay.
Then it starts making photocopies of itself, and then it releases it into our bloodstream.
Right.
So that's how they work. Now, the burst size of a virus is the number of copies it can make a cell make before it kills that cell.
Okay.
Basically.
That's good.
There's about 700 for COVID. So
a cell could do this 700 times before it dies?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then, now the next question is, we know it exists, we know basically how RNA viruses work. How deadly is it? Now that it's September 2021, do we have up-to-date fresh stats on the deadliness of COVID? Because we keep hearing about this is brutal, this is this. Okay, we got data now.
Okay.
And I'll quote nothing less than the American CDC.
Okay.
They're the most well-funded CDC on Earth, and they have a continent-sized area to study with different population densities, lifestyles, ecosystems. It's a pretty good source of data. There's only 170 million people in Western Europe. There's twice as many in just the U.S. alone.
Right, okay.
All right. So, as of 2021, the COVID death rate, that means if you get COVID, how likely are you to die from COVID?
Right.
So if you factor in you might not get it, it's even lower than the numbers I'm going to give you. So for the 17 and under age group, they have a 0.002% fatality rate. Just so you know, if I look at the data of the CDC for influenza deaths in that age group for the last 3 years, it averages about 2.5 times higher than that. So 17 and under have a higher death rate from the flu than COVID. That's per the American CDC. When it comes to our age group, 18 to 49, we're looking at a 0.05% fatality rate.
Right.
That's about twice as much as the common flu for the last 3 years, which is 0.02. Now, if you go to 50 to 64, they have a 0.6 death rate, if they get it, and whereas they have a 0.05 to 06 flu rate death rate in the last 3 years. So that's 10 times more deadly for them than the flu.
Okay.
Now, when you go, the last category they give is 65 plus.
Right.
And they have a 9% death rate for 65 plus for COVID. That's the real mother load.
Okay.
Whereas they'll have a 0.9% death rate from the flu in that same age group. Now, remember that in the 65 plus age range, the majority of these high death rates come from the 85 plus.
Right.
Because the average age of death for COVID is about 81 years old in North America, which is also the life expectancy. So for certain people, it's 10, for anybody old, and also in those demographics, who's dying? The sick and obese.
Right.
Right? So if you see someone who dies of it in their 50s and 60s, they tend to be have some sort of comorbidity.
Right. Yeah.
Either immunocompromised or obese or something. Happens every once in a while, like the flash of lightning, that someone dies that shouldn't have died from COVID. And that is a fact.
Right.
Now, at the same time,
Or that we didn't think should have died.
Correct.
They don't have the comorbidities, yet they still died. Who knows what they actually had, though, that we just don't know about.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. But the thing is, there's no markers for them to have died.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, and we'll get to this in a bit, there are vaccine injuries of people who have low to no risk of COVID, teenagers in early 20s, who die 1 or 2 days or a week after their first or second shot, vaccine shot. That is also happening. So, that's to balance that out. As of September 2021, there's been in the U.S. just under 800,000 deaths due to Chinese COVID.
Right.
Now, there have been an estimated 120 million infections in the U.S.
This is all from the CDC.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
100% all from the CDC.
Yeah.
And I'm going to link it. That means there's an overall death rate of 0.6%. That includes the old and sick, all batched in together with me and you and 2-year-olds.
Right. Okay.
So on average, we have a 99.4% survival rate for COVID. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, what's the difference between natural immunity from COVID, in other words, getting COVID and getting over it, versus getting an immunity from a vaccine-induced immunity? We have some debate right now. There's a lot of people pushing the idea that COVID doesn't allow for natural immunity. For example, they'll say they've tested a bunch of people who have had it, and after a couple of months, their antibodies are gone. But that's normal, right? If you don't have repeat exposure to a pathogen, your antibodies go away.
Okay.
But your T cells retain the memory of how to build those antibodies.
Right.
And they hide in different places in your body, like your bones. And if you get exposed to it again, the factory is ready to fire up again.
Right.
So you do get, for the last 100 years of virology, the standard established fact is that natural immunity far outperforms vaccine-induced immunity.
Right.
Now, we've only had vaccines from the 50s and 60s onwards, but still, we had the... Anyways. So here's an interesting point. As of September 2nd, 2021, about 60% of Israelis' population had been fully vaxxed. They were in the midst, in the summer, July, August, and September, of a new wave of infection, breakthrough infections. About 60%...
What's the definition of breakthrough infection again?
Just a population that has had a wave of COVID and is maybe immunized some way or another. Infections break through anyways.
Right. So somebody who's been shot and still gets COVID, that's a breakthrough infection.
Doesn't have
right?
to be that. It's a loose term as far as I know.
That's what I'm pretty sure that's the definition they're giving it.
Okay.
Right? Breakthrough infections are COVID cases in the vaccinated.
Okay.
Not the unvaccinated, right? I'm pretty sure that's the way it's going.
Well, in Israel, they had 60% of the population fully vaxxed. That's on September 2nd
Right.
of 2021. And in the midst of their new wave, 60% of the new cases were fully vaxxed.
Right.
So they were just as represented in the new cases as they were in the vaccine, in the general population.
Right.
Now, less than 1% of the new cases during that wave were people who had previously had COVID, right?
Okay.
And they had a number of, about 1 million people had and come over COVID in Israel, which is about a population of 11 million.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, because most cases, or at least a lot of cases, are asymptomatic, the real caseload is probably higher, which means that the previously infected and naturally immunized contributed even less to the new cases than we think.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. How do we define case again?
You've tested positive in the past,
Yeah.
had symptoms, and either received treatment. So usually it's symptomatic cases that end up being clocked in.
But how do we get then asymptomatic COVID cases?
We have to estimate that, right? It's a growing body of data.
Okay.
So that means that in reality, there's probably been more infections of COVID already that we just don't know about.
Right. Okay.
Which means the death rates, the hospitalization rates from getting COVID are even lower, most likely, than we think.
Okay.
To me, that makes common sense.
Sure, yep,
But I'm
yep.
giving you the established numbers.
Okay.
So why would natural immunity be better than vaccine immunity? Well, a vaccine, especially these mRNA vaccines, what makes them new, old school vaccines that were established by Jonas Salk, are the actual virus, but like they use heat or something else to basically dull it or kill it so it's not live.
Mm-hmm.
And they put a small amount of it in your body and let your body profile it.
Okay.
So your immune system looks at it, turns it around, exposes itself to it, and builds antibodies.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are, let's say you're a nurse or a doctor working in emergency rooms, right?
Yep.
You're getting the fresh batch, because these viruses, all viruses mutate over time. Any virus, whether it's these new mRNA viruses or an old school virus, is a past virus, isolated and copied a bunch of times and given to everybody. Mm-hmm. It's got value. But what about live infection updates, like an ER or nurse in the, doctor or nurse in the ER, constantly being live exposed to the latest version, the latest mutated version, and multiple variants that are constantly being rising out of an endemic population.
Okay.
Right? It's better.
Yeah.
It's a fuller profile. Now, specifically in the case of mRNA vaccines, they only code for the antigen of spike protein.
Right.
So they take one surface protein from coronavirus. If you look at we've all seen the picture now, the ball with spikes all the way around it. The spikes are surface proteins on a virus. Some of these are considered antigen because the immune system can recognize them, like a mugshot for the police. Mm-hmm. Now, if the mRNA vaccines have the benefit of not having the RNA of the virus itself inside the virus, they just find the flags or the mugshots without letting the bad guys in. Okay. So the mRNA goes into your cell, supposedly does not penetrate your nucleus, so it doesn't change your DNA, but it gets your cell to produce a bunch of spike proteins, which are then erected on your cell and allowing your immune system to interact with it and build antibodies without the actual virus ever entering you.
Okay.
That's the beauty of the technology. Now, the founder of this technology, Robert Malone, went on a podcast recently, and he's been making a bit of noise about this. He's saying, look, my concern is there's growing evidence that the spike protein itself causes an inflammatory reaction in our bodies. It's the pathogen, at least to some degree in some people. Mm-hmm. So you're getting these massive vaccine injuries potentially that are the result of how our bodies react to how some of us react to the spike protein. It could be cytotoxic. Mm-hmm. And there's growing evidence that for some it is.
Right.
Which is why typically it takes 10 to 16 years to safety test a vaccine. Mm-hmm. Not 6 months, right?
Right.
We are the live trials. We are the clinical trials. And that is a fact, right?
Yeah.
The FDA just voted 16-2 against okaying the boosters just last week.
Right.
They have concerns about it.
They voted against it.
Yes, they're
okay.
against it. Yes, they're concerned about it. So when your body comes into contact with the full virus, like a nurse or a doctor in the ER constantly coming across new cases, you get what's called full body immunity, because there's usually more than one thing that the body can recognize on a virus, and you get to come in contact with the RNA itself. So now you have a more thorough 3D immunity from actual live exposure, right?
Okay.
And that has been the standard belief for a long, long time. And we don't really have any evidence to counter that right now. But we're being told by certain outlets that this is new. And maybe it is. But we don't know that, right? That's not an established fact. And it would counter a lot of previous known things about viruses. Any thoughts? You want to interject something?
I'm just listening to the facts.
Okay. Now, the mutation rate of a virus is very important because as it mutates, it changes, and the faster it changes, the quicker it becomes. The past vaccine, the past copy of it, becomes irrelevant, right? Because it's called antigenic drift. You get enough change in the antigens, the body has a harder time recognizing it. Now, the mutation rate is an RNA or a DNA strand is made up of nucleotides, one after the other. They're like letters in the alphabet. So an RNA nucleotide is like one letter in a sentence. The RNA chain is like the sentence. It might be a sentence, it might be as long as a paragraph, it could be a page, it could be a book. Polio, for example, has 7,000 letters in it. COVID has 30,000, right? And it mutates at a certain rate. So every time it's infected 1 million of your cells, it can be expected to have created 4 letter changes, chance mutations.
Okay.
And seeing as you're going to probably make about 1 billion copies of it as an individual if you're infected, pretty much can establish that every person infected will cause at least a 4-letter change, as a law of averages.
Okay.
Now, there's 30,000 letters. How meaningful is that change? Well, that's something we don't understand. It depends where it is. Is it a key spot in the infrastructure of the DNA, of the RNA, or is it completely meaningless? It doesn't change a thing. Eventually, it adds up to something, which is why, with the flu shot, for example, we have to get an update every year if we want to stay profiled, right?
Doesn't the virus every mutation is not a survivable mutation, though, right? Doesn't the virus die out quickly?
Not always.
No?
Nope.
Because I've heard that
sometimes yes.
It generally goes with, more infectious is better because it can spread more. So if it kills too fast, right, or it doesn't infect at all, it doesn't work, right?
It can be both. Because, for example, if it's just changing the surface proteins, which are meaningless, but making it hidden to the immune system, well, then it would be advantageous.
But doesn't our natural immunity recognize mutations in viruses?
To a point.
To a pretty extensive point, though.
Yes, but I mean, if it changes enough, it won't. So, for example,
but if you shaved your beard off and put a fake wig on, I know it's you, right? I can even if you change some things, I still know it's you. My immune system, doesn't that work like that's why it works, right? So because it doesn't recognize just that exact photo of you, I know you. I know that you can come in wearing a different coat or a different hat, and I still know it's you.
But if I changed enough, there would come a point where you couldn't.
Yeah, but how possible is that? You'd have to do plastic surgery for me to not.
But viruses can essentially, you mutate something long enough, it's just 30,000 letters, right? If you change enough of the letters, and the spike protein itself is just some of those 30,000 letters, maybe a couple hundred, I don't actually know.
Right.
You change that enough, it can bypass, especially if you have vaccinated immunity and not full-bodied immunity. Full-bodied immunity gives you more data points.
Right.
Therefore, your immunity will last longer.
Right.
That's why getting the chickenpox is still better than getting the chickenpox shot to this day.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So, now, takes 10 or more years, it takes 10 or more years to establish the FDA to establish the safety of a vaccine. And even then, they sometimes recall them later, right? It doesn't mean the FDA approval isn't like God blessing something.
Yeah.
It's an opinion, right? Which can be right or can be wrong.
Right.
Jonas Salk, the inventor of injecting the actual virus into a person to develop their immunity, he did trials in 1952 and 1953 on his polio virus vaccine. And it got shut down after, I think, about 25 kids died and hundreds got paralyzed. It wasn't until 10 years later, I think it was Albert Sabin, his 1963 oral dosage was okayed by the Surgeon General in the U.S.
Oh, okay.
And to this day, by the way, and I looked at the laws in Canada, no vaccine, even for health professional, has been mandatory this entire time in our history.
Right.
Nothing. They highly recommend it. They sometimes threaten you with not being able to do certain rotations in a hospital, but there has never been the language of you have to. They always left a door in the actual policy, and I looked this up, of having an exemption.
Okay.
They've never cinched it down like they are. This is the first time we've made it literally mandatory to this degree, where they'll fire you if you don't get it.
I've heard that it's been required for kids to go to school. Is that not possible?
But not mandated.
No? Okay.
The legal language in Canada is the word literally says highly recommended. And they basically, like they're doing now, they basically threaten the parents with saying it's a requirement. But the actual law behind it says highly recommended. There is no mandatory vaccination ever been in Canada.
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, but I looked it up and that's what I saw.
Right.
So we're playing a little loose with the language now. We're not quite obeying the spirit of the law nor the letter of the law, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
So
not a doctor, not a lawyer.
not a doctor, not a lawyer. I'm just a dude with a microphone and a YouTube channel talking to my friend, couple of numbskulls just shooting the shoot, chewing the gum.
Yep. Now,
Dr. Bridle at the University of Guelph, he's now been kind of thrust into forefront. He works for a vaccine developing program that's paid for. They get government grants at the University of Guelph to develop and study vaccines.
Okay.
Now, he's come out recently, he's saying, look, we've got about a year plus of mass vaccination data to look at. He is concerned about vaccination mandates for school-age kids because he says, for example, 12 to 15-year-old males, he says, have a 6 times higher likelihood of developing myocarditis from a vaccine than any negative side effect from COVID.
Right.
So for them, it appears perhaps the cure is worse than the disease. Mm-hmm. And as we said before, that whole age group, 17 and under, has 3 times less morbidity from COVID than the seasonal flu. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right, yeah.
So the question is, why the mandate for them?
That's a great question.
Yep, I'd like to know the answer. But more research needs to be done. Because there's also a growing body of data being collected on vaccine injuries.
But if more research needs to be done to answer that question, why are we going ahead with giving shots to teenagers?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Right? If you're saying it might be possible that it's advantageous, we just don't know. Seems like somebody has decided that it is advantageous right now and they're making it happen. Mm-hmm. So do they have some data that the rest of us don't know?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they will always say extremely rare, which is true. That is extremely rare what's happening, right? As far as I can tell.
But not as rare as kids dying from COVID.
Well, the data is starting to change as it progresses, right? We have more time under our belt. We've studied the vaccine effects for more time. Now we're starting to realize why it took 4 to 5 years for the doctors in Canada and Britain, because it was never approved in the US, to find the link, to discover the link and prove the link between thalidomide and congenital malformations. Thalidomide, if people don't know, in the 50s, they're prescribing it for morning sickness to pregnant women, but it caused limbs not to grow. It's what's called tetragenic. It causes massive early developmental womb malformations. It took them 4 to 5 years, and there's now some evidence that there was internal dialogue within pharmaceutical companies where they had a heads up before they ever pulled the plug. They pulled the plug because they were forced to. So large corporations tend to have a self-interest at heart. It's just the reality of history. Big pharma is big business. They're staring over, if we get mandatory vaccines from basically the age of 2 and up, heck, even if it's 12 and up, for every man, woman, child, now we know that the efficacy of these wane with new variants. That means boosters at least once or maybe twice a year for COVID, at least COVID, right? They're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar market about to open up. Profits they've never made before. So there's an incentive for them to behave like a corporation that's beholden to its shareholders.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And you can correct me here, I'm not too sure. Who is it that is responsible to do all the testing and prove the safety of any manufactured drug?
The pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah. that doesn't seem like a very up and up situation. Like, they are the ones making all the money if it works,
Yep.
and they're the ones that we rely on to prove that it works and that it's safe.
Correct.
Conflict of interest
Well, of
definition,
course.
or
And that's why there's an adversarial relationship between the FDA and Big Pharma. It's supposed to be adversarial. Where on one side, you've got the FDA, which doesn't make a penny, supposedly, off Big Pharma. And their job is to keep people safe. So if they don't do their job, you lose your job. That's the way it's supposed to be set up. And on the other side, you get the Big Pharma trying to prove, and they don't get lifelong approval. If the FDA down the road find, like they were warning Pfizer, the FDA in the US was warning Pfizer in June 2021 about their concern for a growing link of myocarditis in young males taking the vaccine. Right? They're doing their job.
Yeah.
Now, if something goes on post-approval, they can recall a drug, say, forget it, you're done. They shut Jonas Salk down, right? Not the FDA, but whatever the equivalent was back then.
right.
So, yeah, theoretically, it's supposed to be the FDA be doing our safety checks as the consumer on our behalf.
Right.
That's why they're a taxpayer-funded government organization.
Right. Okay.
The question I always get all the time is, the main problem is going to be overflow in hospitals, because that'll cause deaths of other diseases. If I can't get in for heart attack, and I'm backed up and I die in the waiting room, well, that's a secondary death due to COVID clogging the emergency rooms.
Right.
That's a very good point, and that should be taken into consideration. Now, here's some counterpoints to that. Height of the pandemic, epicenter of the U.S. pandemic, New York City.
Right.
Okay? They're really worried about this overflow. So what do? They float in this huge cruise ship called the USS Mercy. It's a floating hospital. Massive amounts of, ER or ICU beds, everything, specialists ready to go. It essentially sits in the New York harbor for 2 weeks, basically unused, floats away.
Yeah.
Calgary built field hospitals last year in case of overflow.
Right.
I believe they've been dismantled now. They basically sat there unused.
Yeah.
Now, the next thing I've been told is, no, it's not about ICU beds. It's about staff. We don't have enough staff. Okay, why not work on that? That's a lot cheaper than, let's say, a federal election. It's also a heck of a lot cheaper than CERB checks for everybody, seemingly endlessly. Okay, the money's not going where it needs to go. The other question is, so I have a hard time believing we really have encountered this overflow capacity problem. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. So, if any of you are here that has data to the contrary, I'd be open to be admitted that I'm wrong. But I haven't seen anything to blow my mind.
Right.
And even the Alberta government right now is saying, we just need more staff. It's not about beds availability, it's staff. Okay, fine. Work on that. Now,
So here's my question though. Didn't we have we had a COVID pandemic last year?
yes,
Zero overflow.
that I know of.
And no vaccinations.
Correct.
Fast forward a year, we
We're worse now.
have 80%, 70% vaccinated, and we have way more
Yep.
COVID people in the hospital now than we did last
Not
year.
way more, but more and earlier. Like usually we have a late September spike for the normal flu season. This one came in July, August. The spike went up way earlier. And that's being blamed on the Delta variant and how it affects the unvaccinated. That's the story, at least in Canada. Again, if that's true, so be it, but I want to see the data, right? And it is true. I've talked to friends who work in ERs, and they're like, yeah, no, the majority of the cases in the ER are the unvaccinated.
Why are the cases of hospitalization and ICU going up the more we vaccinate?
I don't know.
It doesn't seem logical to me.
No. And again, the answer has become Delta variant is new, and it's hitting the unvaxxed because they're silly. That's the story. Now, here's some interesting tales. In 2015, the Nobel Prize for Medicine went to Dr. Campbell and his research team for researching ivermectin's efficacy as an antiviral agent in humans. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine have been generic drugs for a very long time, and they have been used on humans for a very long time. So anyways, did we cover the part about how they're used in animals most of the time, all these drugs? Did I say?
No, but ivermectin is for sure.
Warfarin It's given to people with blood clots, right? It's rat poison.
Yeah.
Because it's been used. It's used. What works in one
thinner,
mammal.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
What works in one mammal works in another. We give cows antibiotics. Does that mean if my doctor fills me an antibiotic prescription, he's giving me cow cleansers?
Yeah.
Right?
We've given our dog Tylenol.
Exactly.
Right,
so ivermectin is used on humans, has for years, is FDA approved for years for human use.
But here's the thing. It was either like, I don't know what the right word is, decertified or unapproved like a year ago for some reason.
Okay.
Do you remember that? And why can't you get it? Like you
Yeah.
can't get hydroxychloroquine prescriptions or ivermectin prescriptions, but you used to be able to.
The Canada College of Pharmacists last year made it illegal for pharmacists to fill a prescription for hydroxychloroquine from a doctor if it was for COVID.
Why?
Very good question.
Right.
I've never heard a good answer to that.
Well, here's
Unless
one,
I start going down the rabbit hole, I'll let you
here's
do.
one theory is that in order to make billions and trillions of dollars selling drugs, medical treatments, there's a rule for having a vaccine approved. You can, and one of the things is even emergency approval requires no alternative effective treatments available. That seems to be the kind of timing
Conflict of interest.
Yeah. Like, so why are we kind of like ruling out all of these, at least these two things for sure, that we've used all over the world and are still using all over the world to fight coronavirus type diseases? Why now do we not have those things flowing out of hospitals to everybody who's sick?
Yes.
Right? What's going on there? Because you can't have emergency use authorization to a drug company if there are alternative ways to handle the problem. That's, I think, is a fairly reasonable thing to theorize.
If you have the patent on a drug, only you can produce it. And what do these companies do when they're the only ones who can produce it? They drive the price through the roof.
Right.
Which is why a generic drug becomes hundreds of times cheaper, right? These guys overprice their drugs by, which on one side I understand, because it costs them billions to develop these typically, right? So they have to make that money back. I get it.
I'm not anti-capitalist.
No,
if you've
I get
if you got a business model that works well, use it. But don't cheat.
I get it. Now here's a good question, pawning off what you just said. Has anybody in the world said okay to mass hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin use? The answer is yes. So for example, Congo and Nigeria make hydroxychloroquine as cheap as vitamin C. These guys pop it like we do daily vitamins.
Right.
Why would they do that? Well, it's known as an anti-malarial because malaria is a parasite.
Right.
Like I said before, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin push zinc into our cells at a very, very high unnatural rate, which kills parasites and viruses.
Right.
Now, they have a huge rate of malaria in these countries. So these guys are pounding this, always have, right? So does it have any prophylactic efficacy against COVID symptoms? It won't stop you from getting COVID, but will it help, like they say the vaccine does, to attenuate the results of getting infected with COVID? Okay, well, I'll let you decide if it's working. Congo has 87 million people, okay? Canada has 37 million.
Right.
Nigeria has 201 million people, okay? How many people do you think have died in the Congo since this pandemic started who have 87 million, almost 3 times their population?
Let her rip.
191.
191.
That's an absurdly low number.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I don't know if they had a super China-style severe lockdown, but they even have a lower rate than Australia and New Zealand, who are Western countries with better sanitation, better medical services, and a pretty tight lockdown. I don't think they've been especially tight on their lockdown. I don't think it can be explained just by the fact that they're a warm weather, less obese country, although those would be factors.
Sure,
but not to the tune. We've had, I think we've had 30,000 deaths in Canada.
Right.
This is insane. Nigeria has 201 million people. They've had 2,600 deaths. Okay?
Wow.
Higher than the Congo, but ridiculously less than Canada.
Right.
And we're a very advanced, healthy country. The Indian state in India of Uttar Pradesh has 204 million people. Okay? They had a huge COVID problem at one point. Now, as of September 2021, they'd rolled out 100 million doses of vaccines. It takes 2 doses to be fully vaccinated. So at most, they have a 50 million person fully vaxxed state. Right. That's about it's less than 25% of the population vaccinated. We have about a 75% vaccination rate. Now, we have every day in Canada in the last
But that state in India, it's pretty much COVID-free now, right?
Well, that's what I was getting to.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Yeah. Canada has 37 million people, okay? 5 times less population than the state of Uttar Pradesh. We have, in the last 2.5 months, since mid-June, we've had an average daily new case rate of 4,000. In the last 2 months, they've averaged 16 per day. Now, what the heck is going on? They had a bit of a media blackout in that part of the world around the COVID issue. They started poking holes in that. Some stories have come out, and apparently what they do is everyone who tests positive gets a kit sent home with them that includes, amongst other things, ivermectin. Shouldn't this ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine don't have known side effect risks because we've had them for decades. Yep. They've been FDA approved for decades. We know with the risk we're taking when we take ivermectin much more than we do these vaccines. There's evidence to suggest that the prophylactic use of generic, well-tested drugs is going to be useful as a COVID tactic. But right now, no one in the West is talking about that.
Right. I think with it, maybe the exception of El Salvador picked up the same thing. They have the little kits now that they give out, but no major Western country is even talking about this at all. Like, why are we not even talking about this being something?
And to look at Uttar Pradesh, for them to have 16 cases a day to our 4,000, that's about 250 times more cases in Canada with 5 times less population. That's a rate, just to put it in perspective, that's 1,250 times higher rate of infection here that we can detect. That is what I would like to call statistically significant.
Yes.
If anything.
Yes, that may be a little bit of an understatement.
I mean, New Zealand, they locked down. Even CNN thought it was crazy. Recently, New Zealand locked their economy down again over one single case. Not a hospitalization and not a death.
Right.
One case. That is, if you do that, that means you've absorbed in your mind the idea that you can stop COVID. Which is, they know better than that.
Yeah, you'd think. Do they?
Well, yes. Somebody in there knows.
Yeah. What if it's... Here's the thing, though. This seems like the motivation for all of this action doesn't line up with what they're saying their motivation is for all of this action.
Correct.
Right? So if it's really about people's health, why are we not giving out ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine like candy everywhere? Right? Why the secretiveness and the stopping it so much? If it's really about health, why aren't we, more desirous of addressing many health issues, not just COVID problems, which are mostly recoverable up at 99.5 or whatever that was for most people. Why aren't we tackling fast food? Why aren't they closing McDonald's? Why aren't they stop selling cigarettes? Why don't it's not about health.
Why don't you need a vaccine passport to go to McDonald's?
Right. If this is really about health, why are they doing all of these things? The evidence is there.
Yes.
All kinds of different countries did things differently than Canada did.
Yep.
And to much different results.
Yes.
Why aren't we taking, like we should be, taking the best information and the best results and applying it more ubiquitously?
And the side that we're on, the side of medical freedom and informed consent, where an individual can make their own risk and benefits analysis, I have no problems with the vaccine. Go ahead and lots of people, for all the year knows I'm vaccinated. I keep that to myself.
Right.
The reality is I'm for informed consent, which is the basis of our medical ethics laws. It is in the books, an unalterable fact that we have designed bodily autonomy between us and the state.
Right.
And that goes back to the Nuremberg Code in 1947. And people will always tell me, we didn't put the Nuremberg Code into our ethics law. I'm like, you're right. We didn't verbatim copycat it and say, this is the Canadian Nuremberg. Canada has officially signed on to the Nuremberg Code. But if you read the 10-point Nuremberg Code, and then you go and read our informed consent laws, the spirit and in some instances the letter of the law is identical. And remember, it was the Western countries who designed the Nuremberg Code with which to put to death German physicians after World War II who found to have broken the Nuremberg Code. And then we went on to vigorously write laws of informed consent that mirror the spirit of the Nuremberg Code.
Yes.
So give me a break. The Nuremberg Code is essentially the DNA of what we want for medical ethics guidelines.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And everyone talks about, do it for what I don't like is everyone starts talking in collectivistic terms. So for example, no one cares that the radically different experiment that we did in our part of the world, as far as government, in Canada, US especially, is a self-governing social experiment. What that meant was zero power between us, the people, and God. It was a Christian language document, both the Canada Bill of Rights and the US Bill of Rights and Constitution.
Right.
It said God put into nature laws that are unalienable, cannot be removed from us. They're as real as gravity. Now, obviously, you can break the laws of traffic, but of course you can't break the laws of physics.
Yeah.
So if I walk across without looking, eventually I'll get hit and I'll die. You can break the laws of freedom that we've established in our Bill of Rights, but you can't escape the consequences of breaking that law.
Right.
You begin to oppress a people, something bad happens somewhere at some point down the line. A revolution, misery, a lack of health, misery index goes up. So we've agreed that freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom from government is the essence. Individual rights.
Right.
Private property rights. I take care of me and mine. You do that. You can't steal from me. You can't kill me.
Right.
Other than that, see you later. It isn't about collectivism.
Right.
Marxism is about collectivism. I was thinking about this week, and I thought it's interesting. Most of the people I see that are pushing for mandatory vaccination on the grounds of it's good for the whole, it's do your part, are the older generation who do have more at risk than me. I'll admit that. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is if you shut my business down with lockdowns, I can't feed my family. I got dependents. So I got a lot at risk too. Now, boomers, I hate to say it, boomers love collectivism right now. However, they grew up the hippie generation. What was their main battle cry? Hands off my body, give me total freedom, get away from me, church, government, family, I'm a free entity. These idiots grow up to be the fascists in government. They form the political class and spectrum that are the most oppressive than anything they ever had to encounter. Now, I like to put this back at them. Oh, you want to talk collectivism, do you? Okay. So your collectivism idea is that I take an experimental drug and give it to my kids, even though there's an increasing amount of known side effects, so that I can protect you, basically. Put myself at a certain risk, because there's no risk-free solution here. Forcing vaccination forces me to take a risk, whether you like it or not. So you're forcing me to take a risk to save you as you exit the productive years of your life. How about this for collectivism? You take it on the chin, you die, 90% of the healthcare costs you'll incur to your healthcare system happens in the last 10 years of your life.
Yeah.
Get out of the way, free up medical care, get off the burden, you're no longer productive, get us productive people who are relatively safe from COVID and unknown what our safety risk is from the vaccine, let us feed our families, keep the misery index from going to the way of communism always makes it go, and get out of the way. That's collectivism too.
Oh, okay.
But it's not a one that they like to hear about.
No, you haven't found any takers on that one yet?
No, which is curious because they're all about collectivism, I thought.
Yeah, for sure.
Could be that God, and people, my liberal friends always talk to me about, overpopulation. Well, maybe COVID is God's gift to them. Let's get rid of the old and sick, and we have a refreshed, highly eugenicized society.
A little survival of the fittest.
And we've just escaped the boomers burdening our healthcare system in the last 10 years of their life. Maybe COVID is God's work, right?
Sounds a bit like, the Nazis. Yeah. So.
And caveat, I don't actually want that. I don't want to make them take a risk they don't want to take. Stay home, boomer. Take the vaccine. Be healthy. Let me make my choices for me and my children. That's how our society was designed. I'm sorry to break it to you. It's still the law in the books.
Right.
But the political class is acting like it's not.
Right.
And this is where we have to push back.
Well, I think totally. You can see the relationship, though. They believe, the powers, the political class, right, the rulers, they believe. You were talking about informed consent, right? There's no informed. You've seen a consent form anywhere in Canada for this vaccine? No, there's nothing. You want it? Yes.
There's a waiver saying you won't hold them liable.
I've yet to see any requirement for any informed consent proof that you walk in. Do you want the shot? Yes. There it is.
Yeah.
Right. When I looked up in the States some consent, they're like 3 pages long of you got to read this first and all the other. Anyway, so what they've said is we don't need them to consent or be informed. We know what's good for them.
Yeah.
They just need to do what we tell them because we are the benevolent overlords and we decide what's best for everybody in the collective, right? And the same thing goes with the lockdowns and the business closures. They don't need to consent. We don't even need to explain why our version of things is better. Everybody just needs to do what we tell them, and no amount of arguing or, debate about it is in the cards at all. They don't care. You just need to do what we say. We don't need your consent.
Yeah.
This is just how it's going to roll.
Yep. And what you just described is the exact reason our founding fathers literally went to war. Mm-hmm. They went to war they saw this kind of stuff coming from England back to the New World. Mm-hmm. And they said, we just took a deadly boat ride, a month-long boat ride. We just took a couple generations to find out how to not die here. And now we're establishing a society, and these idiots want to come over here and wreck it, make it like the old world. Mm-hmm. No way. Mm-hmm. And when they wrote to each other, the founding fathers, there was evidence that they didn't think they could win. Mm. They're like, I think we've bitten off more than we can chew.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, probably, but it's the right thing to do because I'd rather die a free man,
right?
Which is every single action movie my guy friends like to watch. Braveheart.
Yeah.
A lot of my liberal friends don't realize what role they'd be playing in these movies. It wouldn't be the main character, okay? Yeah. And after they won, and they'd established the basic prototype of the country, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers came out. Mm. After that, they talked to each other and they're like, how long do you think this is going to last? Mm. And they thought about 30 years. Mm. Wow. So the case I'm making is, it looks kind of grim. If I look around the landscape and I go, who's with me on this? Who sees this as clearly as I do? There's a lot more than we think. Mm-hmm. But not as many as I would like that are willing to begin the movement of true revolt and resistance. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. But that doesn't really factor in for me because I know what the right thing to do is, right? Mm-hmm. Like the founding fathers. So, and then the second thing is courage is contagious. When somebody stands up, maybe another one stands up. And then it compounds. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can win. Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah. God knows.
Exactly.
We don't know. That's one of the things I think the Bible's pretty clear about. We are not to be in the future predicting business.
Exactly.
Right? Take God at His word and just do what's right today and tell the truth. Right? Don't lie. Just tell the truth. Let God deal with the results of that. And I think that's really clear. One of the other things that was coming out when you're talking about all of this, and I'm thinking about it, like, the biblical word for this situation that we are in this world is lawlessness.
Yeah.
Right? And the Bible describes lawlessness as the condition of the world in the end.
Yeah.
And sometimes people think, well, that means that there's a bunch of people running around robbing banks and shooting people. That's not what that means. What it means is the people are not ignoring, like the law has no effect on society. Doesn't mean that everybody's running around being as depraved as they can be. It's just how this goes. And justice is the result of law. And when you have lawlessness, the justice in society goes away. And that's what we're seeing. Things are becoming increasingly unfair, and unexplained and arbitrary.
Yeah.
We have a constitution. The Americans have their thing. We have laws. They're being ignored.
Yeah.
And they're not being enforced. And in fact, they're just making up rules that have nothing to do now with the actual law. If this is not lawlessness, like, the courts don't work anymore, right? The powers that be, the police, are enforcing things that aren't laws on society.
Yep.
This is absolute lawlessness is what's happening here.
And it's lawlessness in just the right places. That is not necessarily people getting raped in the street on your front lawn.
No. That's not what that means.
Sure. It's the powers that be. The head of the law is ignoring the letter
Just
and
think of it
spirit
like
of
this.
the law.
In the Hebrew, that would be Torah-lessness, right? The truth is gone. God's law is gone. We're just making stuff up, and now we're even ignoring the laws that we made.
Yeah.
Right? Not even God. Like, there is just nothing.
Yeah. Which is interesting because when we first abandoned Judeo-Christianity as a culture in the West, on the heels of that come our own laws, man's laws. If we can ignore God's laws, we will sooner or later ignore man's laws.
That's what we're doing.
And we will devolve into a feelings-first, impulsive, mob-driven society.
Yeah. Everybody do what is right in their own eyes, isn't that
Yes.
somewhere? And that wasn't a good prognosis in Judges. Right?
That was the end stage.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is a disaster.
Yeah.
Everybody's just doing what they want. Sounds a lot like these days, right?
Yes.
So, and it's kind of like God's not mocked, right?
Right.
And we can't go along taking, prayer out of schools, and you can't say God, and you can't pray. You got to take down the 10 Commandments. God's like, fine. You want a world that's without me? Go for it, and just. Okay, lawlessness. That's what happens when there's no God and when there's no fear of God before our eyes.
Yeah.
We just throw at all of it.
Yes.
Even the stuff we made.
Yep.
So,
I agree. Well, we'll see you guys next week.
thanks. Bye.